Today, I have something absolutely unique for you. You're going to love it. Every minute, more than 20 million photos are taken around the world. That's more than in the entire 19th century, when photography was first invented. It all started in the 17th century with ordinary silver. Back then, silver was used to make jewelry, coins, and various household and tableware items, and every housewife knew that silver tarnishes. But back then, no one could have even imagined that light, which you can't even touch or feel, also has an amazing power on the skin. And the power is so strong that it can turn white into black. And so, in 1725, the German physicist Johann Heinrich Schulze, while trying to invent a luminous substance, accidentally mixed chalk and acid that had a bit of silver dissolved in it. And after some time, he was surprised to find that the part of the mixture exposed to light had darkened, while the part that remained in the shade did not change its color. After more experiments, he realized the mixture darkened due to the silver content. And so, a discovery was made that 300 years later would turn into a real obsession for billions of people. In 1826, the Frenchman Niepce, who is still considered the inventor of photography, came up with a brilliant idea. He mixed silver with bitumen, the same material used to make asphalt today, and applied the mixture to a tin plate. He placed the plate into a camera obscura, which artists used in those days. Light passing through the openings and hitting the mixture interacted with the silver and triggered a chemical reaction. The brighter the spot was, the more intense the light exposure, the stronger the reaction, and the deeper it etched into the tin plate. The very first photograph in the world was taken using the Invention with a camera obscura that he set up right at home across from the window. Here it is. It's called View from the Window at Le Gras. In order for the bitumen varnish in the exposed areas to sufficiently etch the tin plate, it took a whole 8 hours. That's how long the process of capturing or exposing the world's first photograph took. As you can see, the image is very rough, without any halftones, almost primitive. Looking at such low-quality photos today is amusing, but at the time, it was a major breakthrough, and the invention was immediately discussed in scientific and research circles. However, the enormous exposure time allowed this technology to be used only for photographing completely motionless objects, such as buildings or landscapes. Even trees couldn't be photographed this way. They were constantly swaying and turned into blurry spots. Niepce traveled to London and tried to interest the scientific community, but in vain. Finally, his invention interested French scientist Louis Daguerre. They agreed to collaborate on the project. In 1833, Niepce died, having spent his fortune on the research, and Daguerre continued alone. And it would take another 13 years, can you imagine, when in 1839 Daguerre made the next discovery. He devised a method of applying a silver-mercury mixture to a copper plate, which hardened to create an amalgam mirror. After exposure, an image would appear on it, which looked positive from one angle and negative from another. That's why it was later called the mirror of life. But most importantly, he finally figured out how to fix the effect so that further exposure to light wouldn't destroy the image. To do this, right after getting the print, he would coat it with a salt solution, which neutralized the silver particles in the amalgam. Light could no longer affect the image, and it would stop darkening and become fixed forever. However, the image obtained on such a plate was always a single unique copy, but it was fantastically detailed and incredibly realistic. Daguerre called his method Daguerreotype. Daguerre announced his invention on January 7, 1839 at a meeting of the Paris Academy of Sciences. This date is considered the day photography was invented. The invention caused a real sensation. The French physicist François Arago saw great scientific potential in the technology and suggested that the French government should purchase it. That's exactly what happened. France bought the technology and made it available to the whole world for free. And a little later, Daguerre managed to photograph a person for the first time in history, although it happened completely by accident. Look at this photograph. You see a street and a lone figure of a person, but the thing is, originally Daguerre was photographing a busy street filled with people. The 10-minute exposure of the photograph blurred all the passing people. Only one person remained, who stood still while his shoes were being cleaned. That's how the first photograph in the world featuring a person appeared. Are you looking at it right now? Scientists worldwide immediately took interest in the invention, studying and improving it. The daguerreotypes themselves became so popular that within just 5 years, by the mid-1840s, they had completely pushed artists out of the portrait miniature genre. Why spend a fortune, pose for a week, and risk waiting another month? Get a result that's extremely far from the original, when you can literally get your exact copy in just a couple of days and only half an hour of sitting in a frozen pose, even if it's black and white. For people of that time, the daguerreotypes were something amazing, almost like magic. It became a real craze to order and see miniature copies of yourself or a family member, as if frozen in wax and completely indistinguishable from the original, down to the smallest details. Such incredible detail in the daguerreotypes even sparked a wave of distrust. People thought it was the work of artificial engravers being passed off as a novelty. They armed themselves with magnifying glasses, hoping to see the tiniest engraver's scratches and expose the charlatans, but they never found anything. This is what a daguerreotype camera looked like, often seen in old movies. It was quite a hefty device, but it was still portable enough to transport. Production of such cameras was set up right here. Both amateur photographers and reporters traveled to all corners of the earth for the first time in history, capturing the most remote places on our planet. Daguerreotype cameras were made by hand, adjusting their size to match the size of the future photograph. The plate loaded into the camera was the final photograph. It couldn't be too large, otherwise the camera would be huge and expensive, but it couldn't be too small either, because then you wouldn't be able to see the details. In Europe, the most common standard became 16 by 12 centimeters. And by the 1850s, daguerreotypes had already become serious competition for painting, which until then had held a monopoly on any images of people or nature. In Paris alone, in 1849, more than 500,000 copper plates for daguerreotypes were sold, and at that time, Paris and its surroundings had a population of only 2 million people. But unfortunately, the daguerreotype had one huge drawback, namely the long exposure time. Daguerreotypes were very low in light sensitivity, so the less light there was around, the longer the exposure had to be. Night photography was out of the question. The only sufficiently bright light source for daguerreotypes was the sun. Even during the day, exposure times were 15 to 30 minutes. Therefore, only completely motionless objects could be photographed. Electricity didn't exist yet, and candles gave too little light, so daguerreotypes simply didn't work. But who is interested in photographs of houses? Everyone wanted to see a mini version of themselves on the plate. And for that, those who wanted it had to endure real torture. Here is a typical daguerreotype portrait studio from the year 1842. The person posing is sitting in a chair placed on a special raised platform closer to the light from the glass ceiling through which the midday sun shines. The assistant polishes a silver plate, which is then taken to the darkroom and exposed to chemicals. Next, the plate is placed in the camera, which is set on a high shelf in the illustration. When the model is ready, the camera lens is opened and the exposure is timed according to the clock, depending on the brightness of the sun. The poor model had to sit completely still, fully dressed, under the direct rays of the sun for about half an hour. Then the half-fainting model was taken off the pedestal and the plate was returned to the darkroom, where it was developed with poisonous mercury fumes. Can you imagine that? Then the image was fixed, washed in distilled water, and dried. Finally, the finished portrait was placed in a decorative frame with glass and presented to the barely alive but endlessly happy client. You've probably noticed that in all old photographs, people have very serious expressions on their faces. It's not because something terrible happened to them or that only funeral daguerreotypes have reached us. It's just that it's very hard to keep smiling continuously for half an hour without moving. Imagine if there are several people in their photo, each ordering a copy. For each copy, they'd have to sit still for another 30 minutes. Smiling would be the last thing on their minds. For such portraits, they even use special head supports called Kopfhalter. This is what they look like. A photographic genre that was common during the daguerreotype era but appears unusual today emerged due to the limitations of the technology. At first, it appears the child is being sacrificed to a ghost in the photos. In reality, the monster under the blanket is the child's mother, acting as a human stand. How else can you make a child sit still in one place for half an hour? Admit it, such photos look frightening and even mystical, but they were simply the result of the imperfections of the Victorian era's photographic process. It even has a name, Hidden Mother. So mothers would pretend to be chairs or carpets. Their faces would be blurred out or covered with hair, trying to make them as unnoticeable as possible. In my opinion, the effect turned out to be completely the opposite. To reduce exposure time, early photographers, also known as operators, would sometimes powder their clients' faces, even using chalk. That's why in many photographs from those years, people look like kabuki theater actors. But even with their faces whitened, many still couldn't hold still and would fall asleep in front of the camera. And then the photographer had to retouch the priceless daguerreotype, manually etching in the model's eyes. Not all photographers were skilled artists, so sometimes the result looked like an illustration from the movie The Walking Dead. In general, photography in those days was real torture. But what wouldn't you do for the sake of progress and fashion? And soon, Josef Pitzwall invented a lens that increased the aperture 16 times. It's still called the Pitzwall lens to this day. It was he who became the ancestor of all modern photo and video camera lenses, and it was used right up until the beginning of the 20th century. It made it possible to reduce the exposure time to just 1 or 2 minutes. And this completely changed the game. Photography became quite comfortable, although still a very expensive process. Not everyone could afford to take a photo, and only professional photographers could buy a camera. And as soon as having your photo taken became less than torturous, the fashion for daguerreotypes swept across the world. And so, a completely new means of capturing reality appeared in the world. The first serious competitor to painting in history. Moreover, there are no schools or rules for photography yet, as there are in painting, and the newly minted photographers inevitably become pioneers. Their imagination knows no bounds. Masters of art look down on daguerreotype, considering it merely an amusing craft. At that time, in academic circles, it was believed that only something unique, created by hand by a master, could be considered a true work of art. Photography, in this sense, was perceived as technical and curious, but as a craft without value. So, what did beginner photographers photograph during the Victorian era? It turns out that nothing has changed in the last 170 years. First and foremost, themselves. Look, here is the world's first selfie, taken by Robert Cornelius in 1839. When male photographers finished taking self-portraits, they naturally began photographing women. Here is the first female portrait in history, Dorothy Catherine Draper, taken by John Draper in 1840. He photographed his sister. By the way, this daguerreotype was taken in blindingly sunny weather and set a kind of record for that time. He managed to reduce the exposure time to just 1 minute. Of course, photographers also tried to capture nature and architecture, but you can't make trees stand still and you can't stop the waves for 10 minutes. Therefore, due to its limitations, the main direction of development for the daguerreotype remained portrait studio photography. And of course, cats and dogs. Photography is unimaginable without them, wouldn't you agree? Artists have become the main category of photographers and consumers of photography. Artists have always dreamed of making the world stand still for at least a couple of seconds so they could see and most accurately convey its dynamics in their paintings. How are a horse's legs positioned during a gallop? How does fabric move in the wind, or how does water flow? What poses does a falling person take? And exactly how does a bird flap its wings? And finally, they got a means for this, still imperfect, but nevertheless, something that can freeze any moment, not just for a couple of seconds, but forever. And of course, photography had a strong impact on some 19th century artists. For some of them, photography became a real discovery. Photography made it possible to capture a model first, then leisurely draw and paint it from the photograph. Let me tell you a secret. Artists have long stopped drawing models from life. 90% of modern portraits are copied from photographs taken in a studio or even on an iPhone. Edgar Degas had a strong passion for photography. He pioneered the use of candid shots in painting. His favorite ballerinas appear unaware of the artist, not posing for him. Some are even cropped, not fully fitting into the frame. A typical candid photo composition, wouldn't you say? Secondly, and this is very important, artists no longer needed to learn to see perspective by eye, determining the size of distant objects in a painting, comparing the geometry of space and the proportions of sizes. That is, the world no longer had any doubt that daguerreotypes were the future. Therefore, thousands of enthusiasts around the world were trying to find a formula that would eliminate the shortcomings of the promising technology. And so, in 1851, three inventors at once, independently of each other, discovered the wet collodion process. They were the Englishmen Frederic Scott Arkham and Robert Binem, as well as the Frenchman Gustave Legret. A light-sensitive compound called collodion was applied to a glass plate while wet, giving the wet collodion process its name. As soon as the compound dried, it stopped reacting to light and a fixed glass negative was produced. But that's not all. The emergence of the new photo process perfectly coincided with the invention of photographic paper. In that same year, 1850, the Frenchman Louis de Zerblancar Evrora came up with the idea of coating paper with albumen, which was made from egg whites. The sticky structure of the proteins held the light-sensitive substances on the paper while they were being developed. Then the paper would dry, and the resulting photograph was already very close to what we know today. One of the largest factories producing this kind of paper in Dresden would soon be using more than 60,000 chicken eggs every day. Because of the specifics of the technology, rotten eggs were required, filling all the nearby neighborhoods with a stench for another 50 years. These two inventions allowed the emerging field of photography to kill three birds with one stone and eliminate all the drawbacks of daguerreotypes. First, the exposure time compared to daguerreotypes was reduced by 50 times, down to just a few seconds. And this already made it possible, albeit barely, to photograph objects that weren't moving very fast. Secondly, the image could be transferred from the glass negative to photographic paper as many times as needed. That's how the first mass-produced photograph appeared. And thirdly, unlike daguerreotypes, such images were positive from any angle. The wet collodion process changes the game 100%. It allows you to make as many copies of the same image as you want quite cheaply. The cost of a single photocopy drops rapidly. Now almost anyone can afford them. According to Sontag, photography fought vigorously and fiercely for its place, becoming an integral part of life by the mid-1950s. However, it remained confined to salons, solely in the hands of professional photographers. Although photographs became cheaper, photographic equipment remained expensive and not very portable. Daguerre's camera at that time cost as much as 3 kilograms of silver or $420, while the average worker's salary was $25. A worker would need to save for 17 months to buy a camera, equivalent to over $12,000 today. It's worth telling a bit about how the actual photographing process happened. It's quite interesting. The phrase, "Hold still, the little bird will fly out now," originated around that time period. After finishing the composition and preparing the camera, the photographer would put his head under a black, light-proof cloth to visually fix the shot. After warning the models about the shot and saying the little bird would fly out, the photographer would remove the lens cap and wait for a few seconds. Then the cap would be manually put back in place. And everyone present would pray that the photographer's hand wouldn't shake. If he hesitated for even a second, the shot would be overexposed. And if he didn't wait long enough, it would be too dark. And the less light there was, the longer the lens had to be kept covered. Well, how could you determine the strength of the surrounding light by eye? There were no instruments for that back then. And the sun shines differently every day, so it was very easy to make a mistake. That's why professional photographers developed an internal stopwatch and a keen eye over the years. However, there were also truly resourceful characters. For example, the famous photographer Oscar Rylander used his cat for this. He would look into its big eyes and determine the light intensity by how dilated its pupils were. Very inventive, isn't it? Some photographers travel to different countries and capture the most famous places and landmarks there. One photographer, Félix Beaton, decides not to take the photographs back to Europe, but to print and sell them right there to visiting tourists. That's how the first photo postcards appear. Upon returning home, he compiles the photographs into a book. This marks the emergence of the first photo albums and reportage photos. In 1855, during the Crimean War, the European public witnessed the horrors of war firsthand for the first time. Long exposure times and bulky equipment made photographing actual combat impossible, only its aftermath. Like in the famous photograph by O.S. Sullivan, The Harvest of Death. Interestingly, historians have found traces of manipulation in some famous war photographs. where the scene was arranged to make it more expressive. In Gardner's photo of the rebel sniper's house, the body and rifle were relocated, and in Fenton's Valley of the Shadow of Death photo, the cannonballs were rearranged. And we are all very familiar with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these still rather innocent alterations. Today, we would call them fakes. Well, as for photography as an art form, I'll also tell you about a few extremely interesting points. In 1856, the Swede Oskar Rylander created a unique composite print from 30 different retouched negatives. He cut up the negatives, made a collage out of them, and photographed the collage. This allegorical photograph instantly gained wide recognition, and after the exhibition in Manchester, Queen Victoria herself purchased Rylander's photograph for Prince Albert's collection. Rylander's work was continued by the talented artist and photographer Henry Peach Robinson, who became famous for his composite photograph Fading Away, made from 5 negatives. In this artistic photograph, a girl dying in a chair is captured, with her sister and mother standing sadly over her, while her father looks out of an open window. The photo Fading Away was criticized for distortion, but still widely recognized. And right away, it was acquired by the English royal court, and the Crown Prince even gave Robinson a standing order for one print of any similar photograph. This photograph is considered the very first example of photomontage, but it was created not in Photoshop, but with scissors, glue, and a commendable desire to do something new. Such photo collages became hugely popular, but most importantly, they were no longer just a technical imprint of reality. The author himself contributed his hand, imagination, and creativity to create the final image. This already resembled art. And by 1862, the French Academy recognized photography as a new form of art. However, despite all the achievements, photography still mostly remains confined to studios. The plates in the wet collodion process couldn't be dried, they would crack and peel off immediately. So photographs had to be printed from the negative quickly before they dried out. And this continued for another 10 whole years, up until 1871, when the English doctor Richard Maddox came up with a liquid that, when coating glass plates, could be replaced with gelatin. And that's how the ancestor of the very film that was used until quite recently appeared before it was replaced by digital photography. The appearance of gelatin plates made it possible to prepare them in advance and then take them with you. They didn't lose their properties for a very long time. And this format turned out to be very convenient. Now you could prepare several gelatin plates, take 2, 3, or 4 shots of the same scene, and then choose the best one. We do this automatically now. A photo costs nothing these days, but back then, one shot cost about $4. Imagine if you were charged an average of $4 for every shot you took with your phone. Look at how many photos you have on your phone and multiply that number by 4. I ended up with $170,000. That's how much I would have paid for them in the 1850s. I just have to pause at one extremely fascinating point. A 1 or 2 second exposure finally allowed photographing moving objects, albeit imperfectly. For the first time, people saw exactly how dresses billow in the wind, how they look like frozen ocean waves. Artists all over the world went crazy studying the fluidity and dynamics of nature through photographs and adjusting their own creations. A special interest arose in the question of how animals move. How does a leopard run or a horse gallop? The legs of animals move so fast that it was difficult to follow them with the naked eye. And what about a heroic portrait or a battle painting? In those
days they managed.
Horse racing gained immense popularity in the 19th century, inspiring artists to capture the galloping motion of horses in their work. However, relying on their own ideas, they depicted horses like this, beautifully soaring above the ground in a leap. This was called the flying gallop. And so, in 1872, the American industrialist Leland Stanford, founder of Stanford University, hired the photographer Edward Muybridge to take pictures of his favorite trotter in motion. But he didn't just hire him for no reason. Shortly before that, he had made a bet with 2 of his friends. He believed that during a gallop, a horse completely lifts off the ground, while his opponents thought that at least one hoof always touches the ground. And they made a bet for $25,000. That's about $800,000 in today's money. And Stanford, a passionate debater, built a special structure called a photodrome on his farm to prove he was right. It was a long enclosure, with one side painted white so that the black horse would stand out against it while running. Opposite the wall, 12 cameras were set up, each with a string running from it to the wall. As the horse ran through the enclosure, it broke the strings one by one, triggering the shutters of the cameras. By the way, this invention would later be used as a photo finish in sports. The horse ran past 12 cameras in different phases of the gallop. Contrary to the experimenters' concerns, the photographs turned out quite clear, and for the first time in history, people saw a kind of frame-by-frame breakdown of a horse's gallop. As you can see, Stanford was right, and the horse really does completely leave the ground at some point. It doesn't fly above the ground like a flying cow. Instead, it tucks its legs under itself. Imagine the surprise and embarrassment of many artists when it turned out that the flying dove they so confidently painted in their pictures was physically impossible. Well, and Maybridge began to develop the field of frame-by-frame photography and called it chronophotography. Soon, he would increase the number of cameras to 24, and he would be the very first to recreate the effect of motion by quickly showing these photographs one after another. This experiment, as you have probably already guessed, would mark the beginning of an entire era, which 20 years later would be started by the Lumiere brothers and called cinematography. And so the exposure time was reduced to 1 or 2 seconds, cameras became less bulky, and although it was still difficult, they could now be carried. A photographer's kit now weighed only 8 to 10 kilograms, depending on the number of prepared plates. One thing remained. The last obstacle preventing photography from spreading its wings was sunlight. Electricity, as you know, did not exist yet. The electric lamp was invented in the same year, 1870, but widespread electrification would only begin at the start of the next century, another 35 years later. For now, the only artificial sources of light are oil lamps or candles. They have a yellowish tint. Yellow and orange light was completely insensitive to the technology of those years, meaning that photographic plates simply didn't register it, and photographers could only take pictures under direct sunlight. And it would take another 16 years until, in 1887, 2 inventions were made at once that would lead to photography as we know it, which would last for more than a century. First, a mixture of magnesium powder and potassium chlorate was invented, which, when burned, produced a flash of white light very similar to daylight. You've probably seen in old movies how photographers lift up such a thing, light it, and a flash goes off. Take a look at what a flash kit looked like back then. The powder was poured onto the tray of a special holder and ignited with a percussion or flint mechanism. However, the combustion of magnesium mixtures was accompanied by a very intense release of smoke with an unpleasant smell and a sound similar to a gunshot. Moreover, the smoke from the flash would disperse under the ceiling and settle as a white powder, covering clothing. The problem turned out to be so significant that photographers who used flashes at social events would hurry to leave right after taking a picture before the ladies in expensive dresses noticed what looked like dandruff on their shoulders and a scandal broke out. Fires also started to occur, and as a result, in many places, photography with a flash was soon banned. Despite all its drawbacks, the magnesium flash remained the cheapest and most accessible lighting device and was used right up until the late 1950s, especially by provincial photographers. It only completely fell out of use after the widespread adoption of electronic flashes, and that was still a long way off. And the second discovery in that same year, 1887, was an invention that would turn photography into a form very familiar to us today. That invention was photographic film. Instead of glass, they finally learned to use plates made of flexible celluloid. This became possible after the invention of a special anti-curling layer. At last, photography got rid of the heavy and bulky glass plates. That's all. It seemed like there were no more limitations. And indeed, by the end of the 19th century, photography was already becoming a fairly everyday and familiar phenomenon, but it never truly became widespread. Why is that? And here it's the same reason I always draw your attention to the price. The exorbitant cost of photographic equipment and materials keeps photography in the hands of professionals. And, as you understand, here you need someone with talents outside the field of science or art. A person who can take the final, sometimes the most difficult step, and make a breakthrough technology cheap enough so that it becomes accessible to everyone. And soon such a person appears. He comes up with something that in just a couple of years will conquer the whole world and drive both newly minted photographers and everyone around them crazy, turning them into willing or unwilling victims of the madmen with cameras. In 1888, the precursor to an absolutely brilliant product appears, which for that time became what the iPhone is for us today. It was invented by George Eastman, an American photography enthusiast who aimed to popularize it. He already had a factory producing flexible film, and he came up with a way to use it in a fairly compact device, which would lay the foundation for Eastman's great photo empire. Now, this will seem so obvious to you that you'll even be surprised no one thought of it before Eastman. But all genius ideas are simple. So, in 1879, a bank clerk named George Eastman developed a machine for applying a dry gelatin silver photoemulsion onto glass plates. He established a company to produce such plates. Remember, there was no photographic film back then. Each plate loaded into the camera separately was the exact size of the future photograph. It was the photograph itself. Eastman came up with something unusual: to create a camera that would be loaded with photographic film right away so that people wouldn't have to deal with the extremely complicated process of preparing the camera. And so in 1888, Eastman released his creation. Look at this simple yet absolutely ingenious design. Inside the body, two film rollers were placed vertically. All the photographer had to do was remove the lens cap, wait the required 2 seconds, put the cap back on, and wind the film with the key on top for the next shot. Just 3 steps that even a child could do. Agree, it's an almost primitive design, but thanks to its simple operation, this camera will become a real sensation, a hit and a star of the late 19th century. Eastman named his new very risky camera Kodak, and soon this name would turn his company into a legend. The first Kodak was loaded with film for 100 shots. The camera with film cost $25. That's about $670 in today's money, which compared to $12,000 is a huge leap forward. You have to agree. And at the same time, anyone could use the camera, even without any photography skills. With a Kodak, you could simply go out and take pictures without the need to prepare, transport, insert, or develop plates. Eastman created the first amateur camera. Of course, the price was still quite high, but there were plenty of enthusiasts in the world for the first Kodak model to sell like hotcakes. Can you imagine? The first amateur photo cost enthusiasts $7 per shot. But the experience itself was priceless, completely new and exciting, an experience available to literally anyone who had eyes and fingers. Can you imagine how many people read newspapers and stared at the shop windows with Kodak, dreaming of holding this technological marvel in their hands or taking at least a couple of shots themselves, creating a mini copy of reality with their own hands in just a few seconds? And the lucky owners of the camera became walking advertisements and the object of envy for every boy, man, and often even women. Despite its popularity, the price of $25 was very high, equal to a worker's average monthly salary. In those days, the price was only affordable for the middle class, making mass adoption impossible. Besides, you had to send the film roll to a factory to have it developed and printed into photographs. From sending the film off until receiving the finished photos, it could take weeks or even months if the photographer was far from the nearest processing facility. But Eastman's passion and dream was to make photography accessible to everyone. And he spent a whole 10 years working to make the camera even more affordable. And so, in 1900, he achieved his goal. Eastman released a new legendary camera model. This camera had film for only 6 shots. It was sold for just $1 or $27 in today's money. The film was sold separately for 15 cents. Can you imagine a person worked for 12 years to reduce the cost of his own invention by 25 times and make it accessible to everyone? And this determined the fate of photography and the fate of Eastman himself, who would soon become one of the richest and most influential people in the world. A kind of Steve Jobs and Henry Ford of his time. The Brownie camera series was produced all the way until 1970, a full 70 years. The portable Kodak enables people to photograph everything outdoors, like a madman capturing all in sight. The most popular pastime among these new photographers becomes taking pictures of people on the street, often complete strangers. This leads to much irritation in society. In fact, it is during this time that humanity first begins to think about the rules of privacy and private life. No one likes it when someone suddenly invades your space and takes a picture of you picking your nose, spreading your legs on the beach, or walking with your lover. Passions are running high. To illustrate just how inventive and compact the Kodak was, let me tell you a curious story that went down in history as the creation of the world's largest camera. In the same year, the Brownie Kodak appeared. A United States transportation company, Chicago and Alton Railway, released a new locomotive. To advertise it in all its glory, they came up with the idea of taking a huge photograph. With a 35mm negative, we can now print a photo of any size. But back then, a large photograph required a large plate and therefore a large camera as well. To solve the problem, the transportation company contacted George Lawrence. The photographer was an innovator, and his studio was renowned for creating seemingly impossible, incredible photographs. The task was as follows: to make a photograph 8 feet wide, about 2.5 meters. Initially, Lawrence proposed photographing the train frame by frame, but the client wasn't satisfied with this approach. And then Lawrence designed a completely unique camera, the largest ever created, even to this day. In just a few months, Lawrence managed to design a device that he called the Mammoth. Newspapers often called it the Big Bertha. The camera weighed more than 400 kilograms, and when fully loaded with the photographic plate, it weighed over 640 kilograms. The company spent a staggering $5,000 on this project, an enormous sum for the era. For that amount of money back then, you could buy a decent estate. It took 15 people to load the camera into the van. By the way, the lens was custom made for the company. The photograph was sent to the Paris exhibition and caused quite a stir there. People couldn't believe it was possible to take a photograph of that size. A special person was even sent from the United States to verify the reality of the camera, and after confirmation, fame descended upon the photographer and the transport company. The risk paid off many times over. Now compare this camera with the Kodak, and you'll understand what an important and amazing step Eastman made in terms of camera portability. The Kodak was truly a historic, legendary product for its time, like the iPhone. In 2008, he opened up the world of photography to anyone with $1 in their pocket, a bit of imagination, and 2 hands. This affordable camera sparked a real revolution, the fruits of which we still enjoy with such admiration today. It allowed almost anyone to take photos without any special training. The cost of entering the world of photography was now just $1, and that was affordable for almost everyone. And from that moment, the history began not only for the legendary brand, but also for a new genre in the art of photography, amateur photography. Taking pictures became a truly popular hobby. The formula for success seemed to have been found. What else is needed? But hold on, the world isn't black and white. Imagine that people all over the world have been watching many stories for 60 years, but they've never seen them in color. They always imagine the color of clothes, grass, and buildings. And we already know for sure that humanity will soon figure out what to do about it. The first stable color photograph was taken by photographer Thomas Sutton under the guidance of scientist-inventor Thomas Maxwell in 1861. Maxwell suggested that there are 3 primary colors, and by mixing them, you can get almost any color, including white. As we know now, he was absolutely right. Look, this is the very first color photo in the world. At first glance, it looks like some kind of crystal or insect, but in fact, it's a knotted handkerchief with a Scottish tartan pattern, which is where the name of the photo, tartan ribbon, comes from. Maxwell exposed the photographic plate one after another through 3 different color filters and eventually produced the world's first color image. This experiment made a splash around the world and caused quite a stir. The process was overly complex and the outcome was dubious. Moreover, such images didn't reproduce green, yellow, and red colors, so the research continued, though with great difficulty. And it took another 35 years for a breakthrough to happen in this field. In 1906, Benugo Molca discovered the red sensitizer penosianol. It was used to coat photographic film and paper, enabling the reproduction of the full color spectrum. This invention enabled the release of the first color photography cameras shortly after. The most popular type of camera for color photography was designed by the German scientist Adolf Mitte, and mass production was established by Wilhelm Bernpohl. That's why this camera is called the Bernpohl Mitte. This is what it looked like. In order to get a color image, you had to take 3 different shots with colored filters. On the back of the camera, there's a frame containing the 3 exact color filters. The photographer captured 3 images in red, green, and blue spectrums, or the one we're so familiar with, which is still used to this day. Then the 3 films were layered on top of each other, and magic happened. A color image appeared. It was with this kind of camera that the Russian photographer Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky created one of the largest collections of color photographs of his time. Here's an example of one of them. We'd never be able to distinguish it from a modern one. In the center is the result with 3 color-filtered frames on the side. But as you can understand, this method was very labor-intensive and couldn't become widespread. That's why inventors worked on making it possible for a color photograph to develop directly on a single plate. And in 1907, the autochrome photographic plates by the famous Lumiere brothers were patented and released for public sale, allowing people to create color slides with a regular camera. With them, photographs could be produced instantly without negative film. And even though the resolution of such photographs was very low and they couldn't be reproduced, color photography still became very popular. By 1935, as many as 50 million autochrome plates had been produced worldwide. So photography finally gained color. Can you imagine? It took photography a whole 110 years to go from black and white to color, and our video is also gradually becoming colorful. Do you feel that? Well, while color photography is still solving its technical problems, black and white photography is developing rapidly and taking over the media. Photography begins its journey in periodicals for the first time in history, taking on the role of everyday illustration. Previously, newspapers only published hand-drawn illustrations by artists. The first half of the 20th century was dominated by photographs. It firmly entered all spheres of human activity, from art to forensics and, of course, military affairs and espionage. During World War II, photographs taken by field correspondents became the main documentary evidence of the horrors that were happening in the world. Photographers became real heroes, risking their lives as they made their way into the fiercest battles and transmitted to the rear the indescribable horror and tragedy that any war represents. It was then that the camera was first used as spy equipment. This type of camera, equipped with a 60-centimeter lens, was used for aerial photography in the United States during World War II. It weighed 34 kilograms. For aerial photography, a powerful zoom was required and accordingly a long lens. Even after the war, as the digital age began, the United States government spied on the United States SR with the help of 20 satellites equipped with cameras and very large rolls of film, each roll being 97 kilometers long. Reloading them was impossible. After the roll was finished, it was shot down into Earth's atmosphere in special capsules and dropped into the Pacific Ocean. United States Army planes flew after the classified films. By the way, shortly after the war, one of the most famous photographs in the world was taken. It's a photo of the legendary Nobel Prize-winning physicist Einstein, where he is captured sticking out his tongue. Here is the full version of this photo, which you have probably never seen. It was taken in 1951 during the physicist's birthday celebration. After the banquet, he got into a taxi, but photographers surrounded him, begging him to pose and refusing to let him leave. Einstein, annoyed at the paparazzi, stuck out his tongue at them as he was eager to go home and disliked posing. This moment was captured by a photographer named Arthur Sassa. Einstein really liked the photograph, and he made several copies of it and gave them to his friends. Einstein gave one of the photographs to a television company journalist because he liked the journalist's programs. He signed it in German. "You will like this gesture because it is meant for all of humanity. Civilians can afford to do what a diplomat would not dare. K." By 1950, photography was no longer something new. It had become quite commonplace. There were photojournalists, photography enthusiasts, and professionals in fashion and advertising photography. As an independent form of art, photography thrived in the post-war years, with the 1950s to 1970s being the pinnacle of artistic photography development. Stars such as Henri Cartier, Bresson, Man Ray, Erx Hast, Mark Ribot, Helmut Newton, Richard Avedon, Irving Penn, and Frank Horvath appear. Just look at these photographs. It's literally impossible to take your eyes off them. Photography becomes not just a copy of reality, it powerfully and uncompromisingly conveys emotion to us, fascinates us, and makes us think. Photography expanded its areas of application, cameras and optics improved, the quality was constantly getting better. Color photography and film became available to everyone, cameras got smaller, and now they literally fit in your pocket. However, the process remained largely unchanged until the 2000s. But at the same time, there was a branch of photography developing that was free from all these drawbacks. This branch was solely dominated by one huge and very well-known company. In 1948, this great company invented and released a product that would make its name a household word. They figured out how to combine all the photoreactive chemicals on photographic paper and make the image instantly color and positive. Have you figured out which company I mean? Yes, it's a famous company. They began their research back in the 1930s, and it took them almost 20 years to master and set up production of their revolutionary Polaroid LAND 95 cameras. This is what the first one looked like. You would never recognize it, right? But it brought a completely unprecedented experience of instant photography, which you could appreciate just a couple of minutes after pressing the shutter. This camera turned out to be a real sensation. They managed to patent their invention, and that's why they remained the sole and exclusive manufacturer of instant photography cameras forever. In 1976, they tried to enter the instant photography market, which had been dominated by the company for 30 years. They immediately filed a patent infringement lawsuit and, after lengthy proceedings, won, receiving $925 million in compensation in 1991. Kodak had to abandon this idea. The company had absolute dominance in instant amateur photography for more than 50 years. The photo quality was low, so this technology was not recognized among professionals. Its cameras became especially popular in the 1980s and 1990s. By the 2000s, nearly every family owned one or more cameras, which were very affordable. For example, this one was super popular and quite expensive at the time. I had exactly this one. At the end of the 90s, it cost about $150. But in general, regular amateur cameras were sold at prices ranging from $100 to $300. The best gift for a birthday or Christmas. But the 2000s were just around the corner, and the arrival of a killer format that lacked literally all the flaws of its competitors and made the world go crazy. In photography, meet digital photography. However, in order to dethrone Kodak and Polaroid, it had to suffer quite a bit, 25 whole years, taking on ridiculous and sometimes downright ugly forms. The first experimental digital camera, still very far from its successors, was created in 1975 by an engineer from the same company in Mankodok, Stephen Soson. The charge-coupled device sensor used in the first digital camera had a resolution of only 0.01 megapixels. On a modern phone, this photo would take up only half a millimeter. The data was recorded onto a magnetic compact cassette. Recording one frame took 23 seconds, and the camera weighed nearly 3 kilograms. For the next 6 years, various company departments conducted research, a departure from the individual enthusiasts of the 19th century. Millions, and sometimes even billions of dollars are spent on them. So these companies conducted research for a whole 6 years. Because obviously it was very problematic to use such a monster. And the history of digital photography will begin with the Mavic cameras, created by the company in 1981. Do you feel how companies that are already very familiar to us are entering the scene in terms of modernity? Mavic? It took pictures with a resolution of 570 by 490 pixels, that's just 0.3 megapixels, and only about 2 millimeters on your smartphone screen. To record data, floppy disks or tapes were used as memory cards didn't exist yet. To save photos, they decided to use a 2-inch floppy disk, which was inserted into a separate disk drive, not even built into the camera, but connected to it with wires. You could only save 50 tiny photos by today's standards on one of these disks. But it would take another 7 years before the first consumer-level digital camera appeared. In 1988, it was the DS1P, which the company developed in collaboration with. Its creation was made possible by the development of a new memory card format. Do you see it in the photo? This was the very first prototype of memory cards, so familiar to us today. You could only store 6 photos on such a card. And besides, the card needed a separate battery to constantly power it so that the photos wouldn't be erased. If the battery ran out, the photos would just disappear from the card. But unfortunately, they couldn't release this camera either. And only in the next year, 1989, they finally set up production and started releasing the camera. But it cost an astronomical amount of money, $20,000. That's about $60,000 in today's money. Can you imagine? A camera with just 4.1 megapixels and only 6 photos on board cost almost $60,000. Of course, there was no talk of mass production. The camera was a toy for the rich. And finally, in 1990, more than 30 years ago, an unknown company at the time, Ona, surged ahead. They created a fully digital commercial camera. By today's standards, it was terrifying and incredible. It only took black and white photos with a resolution of 376 by 240 pixels and had just 1 megabyte of built-in memory to store as many as 32 pictures. This technological marvel cost almost $1,000 or about $3,000 in today's money. Unfortunately, that's another miss. The price for such modest functionality was sky high. The first more or less commercially successful and mass-produced digital hybrid was the DCS-STO codec, released in 1991. It consisted of a back with a digital charge-coupled device sensor, connected by a cable to an external unit weighing 5 kilograms, which had to be carried on the shoulder. The disk capacity increased to an impressive 200 megabytes at that time. As you can see, the rise of digital photography was literally littered with the corpses of failed projects. Giants! And with all their millions spent on research, they just couldn't create a compact and affordable camera that could compete with the analog cameras dominating at the time. Either the price was sky high for very modest capabilities, or the device turned out bulky and inconvenient. And even though the very idea of getting a digital photo almost instantly excited everyone, turning it into a commercial success just wasn't working out. Teams all over the world struggled with the problem for almost 20 years without success. Until one company, very well known to us but not previously noticed in the photography market, finally made a breakthrough by releasing a digital camera that consumers really liked. You might be surprised, but that company was? Most likely you didn't even know that in 1994 the company released the STO. The camera was released in a body that resembled binoculars, a popular shape for video cameras at the time, and it allowed you to store 8 photos in its internal flash memory, with a resolution of 640 x 480 pixels or 0.3 megapixels. The camera connected to a computer via a serial port was powered by 3 AA batteries and cost only $749. Actually, the camera was developed by the company, but they gave the opportunity for the first release to another company. Notice that the company was always at the forefront of the digital era in its early days. However, it did not release its own products, preferring to enter collaborations and not to launch a direct competitor to its highly successful analog photo business. Remember this. Very timely, in that same year, 1994, the problem of recording images was also solved. The company released the first flash cards with capacities that seem laughable by today's standards, ranging from 2 to 15 megabytes. Since then, the capacity of cards has increased thousands of times. These cards were huge, 43 by 36 millimeters. I couldn't find the price for these cards in 1994. But the secure digital cards that appeared soon after cost $150 for 40 megabytes. That's almost $4 per megabyte. Standard cards for our time with 32 gigabytes would have cost $120,000 back then. Well, of course, no one even dreamed of such capacities back then. It didn't open a new market at the time. Even at $750, there were few buyers. Despite being called its most unsuccessful product by some, this camera marked the beginning of the technology race. All the photo giants joined in, and some of them we won't see at the finish line. It releases 0.4 megapixels at $899, 0.4 megapixels at $899, and its first 0.3 megapixels at $850. And we also have a newcomer, a company with a camera of 11 0.2 megapixels for only $300. The latter became the first digital camera with a real display and a rotating lens. In 1995, makes the next breakthrough and releases a groundbreaking device with as many as 6 megapixels on board. It was the DCS 460, but it cost a staggering $36,000. However, after Kodak released its camera, the relationship soured and Kodak switched to another partner company. And in 1997, they released the third version of their camera, 200. The maximum shooting resolution didn't change, but a liquid crystal display screen for photo preview was added. This marvel cost only $600. The price is declining, mirroring the same trajectory as Kodak experienced. At the end of the 19th century, A cameras became the first commercially successful digital cameras. But in 1997, Steve Jobs took over as head and shut down the camera project. Meanwhile, competition improved market quality and reduced prices. And then cameras kept getting smaller, their sensors got bigger, and the price kept dropping. In 2003, the average 2-megapixel camera was already selling for about $250, which was quite comparable to the price of film cameras. Remember, they used to cost $100 to $300. By that time, computers were appearing in almost every home and a real boom in digital photography began. In all areas, it started to push out film cameras. In 2001, the corporation announces its bankruptcy. The only advantage of its product, fast photo viewing, ceases to be won. Now, point-and-shoot cameras offer this feature faster and more conveniently. The debts exceeded $1 billion. To pay off the creditors, most of the business had to be sold to the company. But in 2005, there was a real boom in digital photography, and only the lazy weren't making digital cameras. The path, so painstakingly paved by the pioneers of digital photography, was instantly taken over by bold newcomers, and competition grew to unprecedented levels. That year, Japanese companies, the leaders in the global camera market, sold 65 million digital cameras and only 5 million film cameras. By 2006, most manufacturers had stopped producing cameras designed for film, the cost of which had sharply increased due to decreased production volumes. This period marks the beginning of Kodak's decline. 75% of Kodak's profits came from film and photochemicals, and this market was starting to die. In 2012, Kodak, a pioneer in both traditional and digital photography, declared bankruptcy. Perhaps the most significant milestone in the development of photography was the release of the iPhone in 2008. In 2008, Steve Jobs introduced the first iPhone to the world, which would go on to kill the digital point-and-shoot camera market. No camera could offer such ease of use, such a large screen, and such simplicity and ability to share a photo by posting it on social media. There was no need to buy a separate device or print photos anymore. The iPhone offered absolutely all the features of a digital point-and-shoot camera, only much more conveniently and stylishly. And the time between pressing the shutter and showing the photo to friends online was reduced to just a few seconds, compared to days or even months before, in the 19th century. And after that, a huge number of smartphones, in just a few years, irreversibly buried a business that had existed and thrived for more than 110 years. An almost accidental experiment in just 200 years has ground through hundreds of lives and companies and turned into a technology that literally controls our keyboard and sometimes even our mood. Please subscribe to my channel, like this video, and be sure to leave a comment.